When I moved to Japan 8 years ago, it felt like this huge adventure, stepping into the unknown. And in many ways, it was. But there have also been moments where I genuinely thought I was done. Moments where going home felt easier or even like the right thing to do. Looking back now, I've realised that almost none of the reasons I originally came here for are the reasons I'm still here. Moving to Japan is a dream for many people. But in the pursuit of that dream, most don't consider what happens after the dream becomes your everyday life. Your reasons for staying begin to change. Some of them no longer hold the weight they once did. Some disappear entirely. And as Japan changes alongside you, it becomes clearer that living here eventually stops being about the country itself and becomes about the life you're able to build within it. Most people who move abroad are familiar with the culture shock curve, that emotional roller coaster you go through, the honeymoon phase, the culture shock, and eventually the slow adjustment to your new environment. People often talk about it as if you reach your baseline in just a matter of months. But really, in a country that has such a unique culture like Japan, I think it lasts closer to years. If I look back on my own time here, I think it really took me at least 5 years to feel settled to some degree, which is quite interesting considering how many people leave in their first year or two. The version of Japan that you experience in your first year, or even your first few years, is often very different from the version that you will experience once life settles into a routine. But what catches a lot of people off guard is just how long Japan can keep you emotionally stimulated. And the more different it is from where you grew up, the longer that lasts. The novelty acts almost like an anesthetic, and while that's part of what makes visiting or early life here so vivid, it also means that the deeper questions about whether the life that you're building here actually fulfills you tend to arrive much later than they would anywhere else. But eventually, the goals that brought you here, learning the language, experiencing the culture, they stop holding the same emotional weight that they once did. They don't vanish completely, of course, but Japan stops being the center of your experience and just becomes the backdrop. And in all that time, if you haven't built something sustainable underneath it, whether that's a career, relationships, a community, or some kind of sense of purpose, that moment of reality can hit hard. I've met a lot of expats over the years, and without making a universal rule of it, the ones that seem the most fulfilled tend to be the ones who focus on those things, and the ones who seem the most jaded are often the ones who spent years sustained by the novelty of living here without realizing that they hadn't spent much time building much underneath it, and eventually the novelty stops being enough. I think one of the reasons that many people stay suspended in that novelty for so long is because they never quite make that full transition from simply observing life here to actually participating in it. Because as long as you stay psychologically outside of the system to some degree, the novelty will be able to sustain itself for much longer. You're still experiencing Japan as something that is primarily external to you, something to consume, to be fascinated by, or to compare against home. But the longer you stay, the more important it is for you to develop a sense of responsibility to the life that you're trying to build here, as well as the people around you. Most people focus on the external side first, learning the language, understanding etiquette, following the rules, figuring out daily life. But there's another layer to living here that takes much longer and is far less talked about: internal adaptation. Because even if you learn how to function here on the surface, if you never internally adapt to why certain things are done the way they are, or learn to genuinely appreciate some of those values, eventually life can start to feel performative. A simple example for me was just general public behavior. When I first moved here, I made more of a conscious effort to stay quiet on trains or be aware of how much space I was taking up. But internally, I was essentially just sort of performing the behavior because I knew it was what was expected of me, instead of genuinely understanding why it was important to do those things. With time though, I began appreciating how much calmer and less mentally exhausting public life feels when everyone is making those small adjustments for each other. And in truly understanding the value behind it, it stopped feeling like suppression and started feeling more natural. Without that internal shift, it's hard to ever fully feel at home here. And that performative disconnect is what quietly wears people down over time. If you live here long enough, there will probably become a point where Japan stops exciting you in the way that it once did. And some of those places that you might have gone out of your way to visit in the past may just feel normal, or in some cases even inconvenient. And ironically, at least for me, I think that was the point where real life here actually began. Most days you aren't exploring Tokyo or discovering hidden gems. You're working, grocery shopping, paying bills, dealing with frustrations, thinking about your future, the same kinds of routines that people fall into anywhere else in the world. When life shrinks down to the mundane, it becomes very easy to just drift. But it is important not to swing too far into indifference once things feel more normal. Because even after all of that novelty fades, the things that make Japan fundamentally appealing are still there. Not the spectacle of it, but the structure of it, the safety, the trust, and the rhythms of everyday life. And the real challenge is not taking those things for granted once they stop feeling remarkable in the way that they once did, whilst still building a life that stands on its own beyond them. One thing that is important to keep in mind is that Japan doesn't need you, and I don't mean that from a macroeconomic perspective or the ongoing debates about immigration. I mean it on a purely personal and individual level. When you live here long term, you have to accept that this country wasn't designed around you, and it doesn't bend to accommodate to the individual in the ways that you might be used to back home. In many Western cultures, we are conditioned to believe that if a system or a rule doesn't make perfect sense to us, we are justified in challenging it or in expecting it to flex for our specific circumstances. But here the cultural story was written and deeply agreed upon long before you or I arrived. There is no blank chapter that's waiting for a foreign perspective to complete it. Over the years, I've watched people move here or visit and, often without realizing it, try to reinterpret Japanese behavior through their own cultural framework. Usually it isn't malicious. It's just a result of spending your entire life inside a different system for communicating, solving problems, and relating to the people around you. For example, there have been increasing situations where many foreign visitors have tried to tip staff at restaurants because tipping in their culture is a sign of appreciation or a kindness. But in Japan, that can create a bit of awkwardness because good service is generally expected to be part of the job rather than something that you have to pay extra for. So what might feel respectful in one cultural framework may just feel confusing or uncomfortable in another. So if you try to apply your own cultural logic to a system that's completely different, you don't end up changing the system, you'll just run into friction yourself. Over time, this creates a very subtle awareness that you're always operating inside a system that you didn't originate from and you cannot fully redefine. Job opportunities, for example, reflect this directly. I remember trying to move out of English teaching after my first year or so in Japan and realizing very quickly that outside of a fairly narrow set of roles, being a foreigner was often treated less of an asset and more of a complication. Most companies here aren't looking for someone who just wants to experience Japan. Instead, they want someone that has the skills to do the job and can already reliably function inside the existing system. And if you didn't grow up inside this system, your instincts and baseline expectations of what a workplace should be like are innately going to be different. So even when you intellectually understand certain workplace norms, even ones that are perceived as negative, you're going to be far less willing to tolerate them long term. And that creates a dual limitation on your career path, because in addition to companies being selective about the foreigners that they hire, it's also that you naturally filter out the environments that don't feel sustainable to you. On top of this, in most situations, your ability to even live in Japan is entirely conditional. I just renewed my visa for the first time in 5 years, and I became increasingly anxious up until and throughout the renewal process. Maybe it's just because it's been such a long time since I last did my renewal, but it is a very stark reminder that you don't have an inherent right to be here, you just have permission. And permission can always be modified or even revoked based on shifting laws, employment status, or a number of other factors. And that sense of conditionality doesn't stop there. Even the warmth and politeness that you experience in daily life, while completely genuine, is often structural before it is personal. It comes from a baseline level of social consideration that is tied to the role that you occupy in that particular moment, whether you're the customer, the passenger, or the neighbor. And over time, that can create a very subtle sense of distance that's quite difficult to fully explain to someone who hasn't lived here. But ultimately, long-term life here becomes much healthier once you just stop holding it up to your own preconceived standards and just accept it for what it is. Sure, your presence was never essential to the functioning of the country in the first place, but in many ways that's a given and it shouldn't be a surprise. But if you stop expecting the country to validate your presence or shift itself around you, it becomes a lot simpler to focus on building a meaningful life within it. But why accept all these limitations? I personally feel there's something very profound in learning not just to function, but to truly contribute to a system that you didn't grow up in. The safety, the clean streets, the efficiency, all the things that people fall in love with on short trips, they aren't accidental. As a tourist, you can enjoy the output without contributing to the input, but these things are held up by a collective discipline, hard work, and a culture that often prioritizes the group over the individual. When you've lived here long enough to actually understand how it works, and you find yourself genuinely participating in it rather than just passing through, that feels different, more earned, because you still retain some of the perspective and appreciation that comes from being an outsider while also contributing to the society that created those things in the first place. You don't need to measure whether you truly belong. Instead, you just need to start paying attention to the things that actually make a life meaningful anywhere, and all of the small everyday moments that slowly make life here feel like home. One thing people rarely talk about is that while you might expect yourself to change over the years, you don't always think about how the country itself will change at the same time. It's also possible that the version of Japan that you originally fell in love with will slowly begin to change while you're still trying to build a life inside of it. Japan is going through some very obvious shifts right now. The most obvious being the sheer scale of global attention that the country now receives, along with the growing number of foreign residents. Anyone who has lived in Japan since before COVID would probably agree with me when I say that the atmosphere prior to 2020 is really different to how it currently is, especially as a foreigner. Part of that is simply scale. Places that once felt relatively quiet or niche now feel globally exposed. Another part is the nature of attention itself. In the past, many people who came to Japan tended to arrive with a strong personal interest in the culture, language, or society. But now, Japan is also heavily consumed through algorithms, short-form content, and online hype cycles. For some visitors, Japan becomes less of a real place and more of an experience to capture, perform in, or check off. And when people primarily engage with a place through the lens of consumption, the social awareness and restraints can slowly start to wear down. Just recently, 2 American tourists were arrested for climbing into the monkey enclosure in Ichikawa Zoo, which reportedly led to a photography ban. Individually, these incidents tend to be small, but they keep happening, and collectively that is inevitably going to shape perception. So the actions of other foreigners will inevitably affect the overall perception of foreigners in general, whether that feels fair or not. At the same time, there also seems to be a growing tension underneath all of this. Many of the things people around the world admire about Japan depend on a very delicate social balance. And as tourism and migration increase at a scale the country has never really experienced before, some Japanese people are beginning to question how much pressure that balance can absorb without changing. In other words, there's a very real emerging fear that the things that attract admiration could generally be weakened by the scale of the attention itself. So it's inevitable that the country will change over time, but when the version of Japan you fell in love with starts shifting around you, it forces the question, what are you actually here for? If it was the atmosphere, the novelty of being an outsider, the feeling of living somewhere extraordinary, those things naturally fade over time. And in a strange but inevitable way, the place that you came from won't stay frozen in time either. After enough years of living abroad, even going home can start to feel a little bit unfamiliar. You may realize that the version of yourself that naturally fit in there may not exist in the same way. That said, it's worth separating what's actually changing from what the content is telling you is changing. The clips, the discourse, the viral incidents, they've multiplied far faster than the reality on the ground. Walk around most neighborhoods, put the phone down, and the atmosphere is usually quieter and far more ordinary than your feed might suggest. Japan is changing, but it rarely feels as dramatic as it can appear online, and the things that keep you here eventually shift from spectacle to very small and very specific. A group of friends you meet on a Monday evening, a coffee shop or restaurant where they know your order, a neighborhood that finally feels like yours. None of it sounds like a reason to build a life in a foreign country, but somehow it is. That shift matters because long-term life anywhere depends far less on excitement than it does connection. And you eventually realize that there never was some final point where everything just clicks into place. The journey never really ends and there is no destination. And maybe accepting that impermanence is fitting in its own way. After all, the idea that things change, fade, and evolve over time is deeply embedded in Japanese culture. Even after 8 years of living here, I still have to ask myself, what actually keeps me here? Whatever I came here looking for, I'm sure I found, just not in the way that I thought I would. I'm still here not because Japan is perfect, or because I always feel certain about the future. I'm still here because of the life I built inside it. And most days, that's enough.